I'm Jeff Swanson. I'm a sociologist by training. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University School of Medicine, and I'm a faculty affiliate at the Wilson Center for Science and Justice at Duke Law School. A Psychiatric Advance Directive is based on a couple of simple ideas that we take for granted, but they're old ideas, and Western philosophers at least have written about them for centuries. And one is the idea of the individual person as a self-determining individual with rights. And we've heard the term autonomy. That comes from two Greek words, auto for self and nomos for rule or governing. So an individual as a self-governing entity, you can make your own decisions about your own life and determine the course of your life. The other is the idea of the continuity of identity, that a person throughout their life course is the same person. Although our language allows us to say, oh, he's not the same person he was when he was 25. We know what we mean by that. But actually, I'm the same person I was when I was 25, and I made some pretty consequential decisions at the time when I looked out into my future and I thought about it, and I was able to think about what I wanted, and I decided to get married, for example. But the assumption of a self-determining individual is you have the ability to make decisions and that those decisions are reliable. And that actually isn't true sometimes. What if you get in a car accident and you are unconscious? You can't make decisions about what treatment you might want, for example, in the hospital. So an advance directive is a legal tool that kind of compensates for the times when we can't make decisions for ourselves, but it allows that kind of continuity of identity, that person, to persist. So a medical advance directive, that got some traction with the idea of a living will where someone could write a document in advance to say whether they would want to have life-sustaining medical treatment, like be on a ventilator or a feeding tube if they were at the end of their life. One of the key court decisions that is responsible for modern jurisprudence and practice regarding medical advance directives was the case of Nancy Kruzan versus the director of the Missouri Health Department in 1990. And Nancy Kruzan got in a car accident. She was in a persistent vegetative state, and her parents wanted to withdraw life support from her. And the hospital officials refused to do that without court authorization. And that decision about whether that could be done went up to the Supreme Court, and what they said is it depends on what Nancy Kruzan, the patient, would have wanted. How do we know? Well, they said there has to be clear and convincing evidence of what that patient would want if they're now incapacitated. And pretty much the only way to do that is to have a document in advance that says so. That was really kind of cemented the idea that you had to have a written document about your wishes for a time when you were incapacitated. Then there was a piece of federal legislation, the Patient Self-Determination Act. It came out the year afterwards. And that required hospitals receiving federal funds to ask patients if they had such a document, an advance directive, when they were admitted to the hospital, and they had to honor it. And they had to do what the patient would have wanted. So that legal infrastructure gave the mental health stakeholders the idea that they could use the same thing, an advance directive, for a time when someone was incapacitated due to a mental health crisis. So some of the early statutes, Oregon was one, an advanced declaration for mental health treatment, and it was paired with a proxy decision maker, which that had been around for a while, but some of those laws did not allow the proxy decision maker to authorize admission to a psychiatric hospital. So the combination of those two was thought to be something that could really help a patient receive the treatment that they would want. For example, if they would like to be in the hospital, but at the time when they're ill, say with schizophrenia, they say they don't want to be, this would allow them to do that and to avoid involuntary commitment and this legal option of forced, coerced treatment. So the first laws really were put in place in the early 1990s, 1993, and following, and now there are 27 states that have such laws, and almost every state actually has some way of doing advanced planning for a mental health crisis. In the mid-1990s, the situation with psychiatric advance directives was that it was a good idea, a promising idea, and a lot of people were interested in it, and state laws were being passed to authorize psychiatric advance directives, but we didn't really know much about whether people would want them, what was the demand for advance directives for mental health care, and would psychiatric patients be able to complete them? Would they be able to document their preferences in a way that would represent their wishes and that would also be clear to, say, a future inpatient care team making decisions about the treatment for a person? And would they actually work? Would they provide a benefit over time? Would they help people, for example, to avoid involuntary commitment or other kinds of coercive crisis interventions that are so unpleasant for people sometimes who have an illness such as schizophrenia that is often characterized by periods of fluctuating capacity to make decisions and sometimes multiple hospitalizations over time. So that's when our research group got interested in advance directives for mental health care. And one of the studies we conducted was a study of the prevalence and interest in advance directives in psychiatric outpatients. And this was basically a survey of a large sample of outpatients in public sector mental health programs in 5 states. And they were asked, would you want to have a psychiatric advance directive, after we explained what it was to them. And the demand for it was really surprisingly high. That was the good news. The bad news is that a very small percentage actually had one. And so what it looked like was that there was a potential for many people to have an advance directive who currently did not have one, but if they knew about it, and if someone helped them do it, then they would want to do that. So the second project was to figure out how you get people to actually complete advance directives in a way that's going to be reliable and accurate and legally sufficient. And we developed an intervention called the Facilitated Psychiatric Advance Directive, where a trained layperson could essentially do kind of like an interview with someone and go through the legal documents, which is pretty daunting, and actually help them do it and do everything that they need to make sure that it's completed and that it's actually witnessed and notarized as required by the law in North Carolina. And so we conducted a randomized trial of that intervention and randomly assigned people to either receive written documentation and try to do it on their own using resources that were available in the community, or to sit down with a facilitator and have this sort of hour-long session that elicited their preferences and helped them to shape those into this document in areas of medication choice and hospital choice and who you'd want to visit you if you were in the hospital and things like this. And it was wildly successful. It showed that a large percentage of the people in the randomized group could actually did complete an advance directive, and a very small proportion in the control group who were left to their own devices to do it. And then we followed up with a study that actually looked to see out into the future after people did an advance directive, following them up for 2 years in the community. Did it make any difference? And we found that the people who completed a psychiatric advance directive had a significant reduction in the incidence of coercive crisis interventions, like getting transported to treatment in a police cruiser or with handcuffs on, or being involuntarily committed to a hospital, or having seclusion and restraints used in the hospital. And so that was actually a very positive result. Beyond that, though, there was the need to do research on implementing these, because that study was done in fairly controlled conditions, not in the kind of real world of mental health care. And so a sort of third generation of the study was to say, let's do a trial to see whether people in ordinary care settings in the community, like an assertive community treatment team, we train the care team there, whether it's a peer facilitator or maybe a clinician on an ACT team, to do this facilitated psychiatric advance directive intervention and to see whether that could be done. And that study compared clinicians versus peer facilitators, someone who has lived experience with mental illness as facilitators, and showed that they were pretty much equally successful in helping patients do this. And maybe the completion rate was not quite as high as in the original, more controlled trial, but much remains to be done. We're at a situation now where we know a lot about psychiatric advance directives as an effective legal tool for people, but we need to know more about how to actually implement them in the community. The main question about how PADs, psychiatric advance directives, can achieve their promise and actually benefit people in North Carolina is how we actually get consumers to learn about them and be able to complete them, and how we get providers, clinicians, to actually also be aware of PADs and to support the idea of using them in times of crisis. If you think about a PAD as essentially a communication device, there's two parts to that device. One is the transmitter and one is the receiver, or a communication system, shall we say. So the transmitter part is the patient, the consumer, the person who documents their preferences for treatment during a mental health crisis. And that's kind of the message that's being transmitted. If that's all there is, they might as well just roll it up in a bottle and throw it in the ocean and hope somebody finds it. There has to be the receiver on the other end of it. And those are two sets of problems. The receiver would be, say, the hospital or the doctor who's making decisions about a patient in a crisis, someone in the emergency department. And a couple things have to happen on the receiver end. One is the document has to be available maybe in a registry or in someone's record. It has to be retrieved, it has to be read, and it has to be followed. And there's still plenty of resistance among psychiatrists, for example, to the idea that a patient's document should determine their care. Doctors might be just as likely to think that they're the experts and they should decide, for example, whether someone needs to be in the hospital and what medication they should receive and so on. Even after all of the attention and research on advance directives, the problem is that very few people still have completed an advance directive, and there isn't really such a critical mass of these documents out there to turn around the cruise ship of crisis care, which is pretty set in its ways. And so there needs to be education and outreach on both of those fronts, I think, in North Carolina. The other thing I would say about it is that an advance directive for treatment, for care, is probably only going to be as effective as the underlying care system that it's talking to. So if you have a mental health care system that is fragmented, that is overburdened, that's under-resourced, that doesn't work very well for some people, simply having a document saying what your preferences might be for a crisis isn't necessarily going to fix that all by itself. Now, there is an argument to say that if you have a fragmented mental health care system, a document would be a good idea because maybe the outpatient doctor and the inpatient treatment team won't otherwise have any communication about who this person is and what their history of illness is. But actually, I think it's more the case that psychiatric advance directives and the evolution of their use needs to work in tandem with reforms in the mental health care system that will actually make things better in terms of the availability and access to care that people have, access to inpatient treatment when they need it. If there is a severe shortage, for example, of acute psychiatric inpatient beds and people end up spending time in an emergency department, not because they want to be there, it might not matter what their advance directive says if an inpatient bed is not quite available to them. We had a case in our research study where a man who had completed a psychiatric advance directive on our research study got into a mental health crisis where he had stopped taking his medicine, and he was picked up by the police, and he told the police he had a psychiatric advance directive, and they'd never heard of that before. And he was, despite his wishes, transported in a police cruiser in handcuffs to a local hospital. He told the people at the hospital that he had an advance directive, and they were unaware of it. They didn't quite know what a psychiatric advance directive was. Turned out it was in his record, and he said that he wanted to be admitted to his local hospital and not be taken to the state psychiatric facility some distance away. And nevertheless, there was no bed available, so he was transported again in the police cruiser to the state facility. And when he got there, he was given the one medication that he said he did not want to have, which is haloperidol. So in his case, it didn't work very well. I thought that in a case like that, the patient would be very cynical and say, this didn't work at all. It's not worth the paper it's written on. On the contrary, what he said was, this just shows how much work we have to do, and you guys need to get out there and educate people and work with the system of care so that this legal tool can actually be used. And he said, from now on, I carry it around with me in the visor of my car. That was an inspirational story to me, even though it was a disappointing one. I think we do have a lot of work to do. But advance directives remain, I believe, a very promising intervention. We just need to focus on the implementation of this idea in the community.